So, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome you to this seminar that is convened by Al Jazeera Centre for Studies in cooperation with Al Jazeera Mubasher, the election of Raisi, the significance and impacts of such election. So the impact, the repercussions as a result of the American sanctions, particularly the depreciation of the currency and an increase in unemployment and also the fact that Raisi needs to persuade the Iranians that he's going to be the president of all Iranians. Also, we have the increase of inflation. The new president would need to deal with a number of challenges, including the nuclear deal and the relationship with the United States of America and the EU, in addition to the position of Iran in the region in the light of the new American administration. I would like to welcome from Tehran Mr. Hassan Ahmadian. You're in vision. Gentlemen, you all appear in vision. We can see you. We have Dr. Fatima Smadi. She's been introduced now. Professor Garner, you're being introduced now. You're in vision. We can see you. Welcome. From Philadelphia, Mr. John Gazvinian, you're being introduced. Welcome to you all. We would like to start our discussion with Dr. Ahmed Hassan Ahmadian, who is a researcher specialized in political science. So what are the main priorities for Raisi? We talk here about the internal policy of Raisi. So Mr. Ahmadian is going to be answering the first question. Please bear with us.
طبعا هناك أولويات متعددة تكلم عنها الرئيس المنتخب في أثناء حملته الانتخابية وبعد ذلك أيضا. هناك عدة برامج خطب حولها وأولاها اهتماما في المناظرات الانتخابية أيضا. المهم في ما يتكلم فيه الرئيس هو أنه
I'm facing difficulties hearing Mr. Ahmadian. I don't know why. So please bear with us. So you were talking about the discourse. So can you let us know? So we cannot hear what he's saying, I'm afraid. So we're going to come back to Mr. Hassan Ahmadian. Would like to move now to Dr. Fatima Asmadi, senior researcher from Al Jazeera Centre for Studies. So what are the opportunities for success when it comes to the priority that is given by Hassan Raisi to the neighboring countries? I would like to say that despite this fact that they talk about constants in the foreign policy of Iran. So this is very important indeed. But when it comes to the foreign policy of Iran, we have seen pivotal changes and differences between the different presidents of Iran. With regard to the question that you posed, there is a clear difference between what was expressed and presented by Ibrahim Raisi when he talked about the neighboring countries as a priority for him, compared to the discourse that prevailed during the presidency of Hassan Rouhani. When Rouhani became president to Iran, we found that he tried to solve issues through reinforcing relations with the West, particularly when it comes to the moderate theorists close to Rouhani said that the problem of Iran cannot be solved unless they have relations with the United States of America. During the presidency of Rouhani, although he had a number of initiatives with the neighboring countries, but the relationship with the neighboring countries, particularly the GCC, this relationship was not not a priority for Hassan Rouhani. Ibrahim Raisi has a different policy, and this has reasons. In his invitation to Saudi Arabia, it was a very competitive kind of relationship, very cold relationship. When we talk about Rouhani, we talk about relations that have been almost severed between Saudi Arabia and Iran during the Rouhani presidency. So after that, Ibrahim Raisi came to talk about a different relationship with the neighboring countries. We cannot imagine such statement without imagining a different relationship with the GCC, particularly Saudi Arabia, because there are so many problems that are pertinent to this particular problematic, directly speaking, and this has impacted the relationship of Iran with the Arab world. With regard to Raisi's discourse, I think we should say that it is too early to know the ministerial cabinet or the ministers that are going to be appointed by Raisi. But despite all that, and based on a number of factors, we can delineate the policy that is going to be between Iran and the neighboring countries. We can see some of those features, and this is based on his electoral program 2017-2020. There is similarity between the two programs. We do not see central differences when it comes to the points that I mentioned. And talking about the Iranian hegemony in the region, if we go to the discourse that was used by Ibrahim Raisi with regard to this particular point, I can say for sure that this is going to be a big problematic when it comes to the future of relations between Iran. It has been and it will be. Why do I say that? Why do I say that this is going to be a continuation? Because if we go to what Ibrahim Raisi said, he talks about the regional hegemony of Iran as a very important trait or feature of the spirit of the revolution. So he talks as a guarantor of the security of Iran and the stability of the region. So what Ibrahim Raisi talks about, he talks about a point whereby he can build regional security, and the neighboring countries see this differently. If we look at the Saudi Arabian discourse, we find that this particular point was one of the problematics in the relationship between the two countries. You have mentioned the discourse of the two presidents, and also you talked about certain points. So I would like now to go to Dr. Hassan Ahmadian. Dr. Ahmed, I had asked you before the line was cut. I talked about the priorities of Hassan Raisi, Ibrahim Raisi, sorry, internally. So for the president-elect, the economy is the priority and not politics. So if we try to analyze his discourse, we will see that he is part of the political right, and he is also a part of the left when it comes to the economy. So when we look at the current president and the president-elect, there are differences in terms of politics. Ibrahim Raisi is a right-wing president, and he wants to reinforce the economy of the state, and based on his discourse, socially speaking, based on those who have voted for him, those who voted for him wanted him or want him to support poor persons, lower middle class persons, to support them economically, and also to increase their for them to be able to have a better livelihood in general. And this discourse, what does it mean? It means that the public sector is going to be much more important, and also talks about the oversight of the government to target corruption. And this is one of the points that he underlined in his discourse, and he wants to concentrate on that. He also talked about structural changes that he wants to carry out in the Iranian economy, particularly that he was part of the judiciary and he has always been fighting corruption. So he wants to have changes that would lead to development. So perhaps we can call his economic program, we can call it a program that is based on national development. Which is different from his predecessor, President Rouhani, who tried always to underline the linkage between the Iranian economy and world economy. Raisi concentrates on building the economy internally, which means that this is going to reinforce the role of the government in general. It is going to inflate the role that is played by the government. So politically speaking, so what are the priorities of Raisi? They are not different from his predecessors. There are two discourses. The opposition discourse that says that he's going to repress and he's going to have a kind of have a kind of a monopolitics or monopolitical system, or he invited the different representatives of the community to listen to their ideas, and he promised to have a multilateral government that would include so many political parties and not concentrate on only one political party. So he wants to have a diversity of expertise. So those who know the president-elect know that he is not an extremist personality. He is much more moderate compared to the current president. And Iran doesn't need to have any popular anger. Yes, there is anger and concern vis-à-vis the situation currently, the economic situation, but he does not want to have a lot of anger. So in my view, so this is also going to manifest in the foreign policy of Iran. So, Mr. Gartner, Professor Gartner, you're being introduced by the presenter now. Welcome. How do European countries see the election of Raisi, particularly when it comes to the nuclear deal and the negotiations relevant to the nuclear deal? Go ahead, sir.
Yes, first of all, I have to say it goes without saying that the European Union issued a statement of concern about Raisi's human rights records. The European Parliament issued a strong statement according to this issue. However, the European Union needs to have an interlocutor, so they have somebody to speak to, and the European Union developed this idea of principled pragmatism, which means the European Union has its principles about democracy and human rights, but it talks to governments because there are common interests. So, especially because you asked about the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, there is a lot of stake, not only for the US and Iran, but also for the European Union. After all, the European Union called the old JCPOA of 2015, the the masterpiece of multilateralism. So if now the talks fail, it would be a failure of effective multilateralism. And linked to this, because Dr. Ahmadian was speaking about the economy. On top of this, of course, the economic relations between the European Union and Iran improved after 2015, but then collapsed after 2018 when President Trump left the deal and threatened European companies with secondary sanctions if they deal with Iran. That means the economic relations between the European Union and Iran collapsed by 75%. So the European Union tried to save some of this and constructed this index mechanism which should bypass American sanctions, but it was not very effective, but still the European companies were afraid of American sanctions. So it was not before President Biden announced that he would want to go back to the GCPOA. Politically, the European Union was very silent during the period between 2018 and 2020. But when Joseph Biden announced to go back to the GCPOA, the European Union discovered that it has a responsibility here. And after all, it chairs the commission, the joint commission of the GCPOA. And the European Union summoned a meeting in December 2020 to restore the GCPOA. So they agreed to focus on the nuclear issues and let aside the missile issues and regional issues. So several other meetings followed, and that led to the negotiations in Vienna, which started on April 7. So there were, of course, a lot of stake because if the talks failed, it would be a failure of the Joint Commission as well, which organized these talks. And there was, of course, some debate when
Sorry, Professor. Professor Garner, we're going to move to Mr. John Qazrizian. So do you think that the current negotiations are going to be successful in this very short period of time that remains in the time of Rouhani, or presidency of Rouhani? Go ahead, sir.
Well, that's very difficult to say, and I think that all relevant parties have been keeping relatively discreet about the progress of negotiations, although it does seem that given the number of rounds of serious talks that have taken place now for several months, that obviously something substantive and meaningful is being discussed, one would hope. I think that obviously, given that there's very little time remaining in the Rouhani presidency, there is a little bit of a sense of urgency, but perhaps not as much as is sometimes reported. I think at the end of the day, one of the things that's not always appreciated is that Iran's foreign policy, although it takes on a different tone and a different approach under different presidents and different administrations, is actually very consistent when it comes to certain red lines, and especially those red lines that surround issues like the country's nuclear program. The real priority for the Iranian state at this point is getting sanctions removed to the extent that's possible, and being able to get the economy back on its feet. I think that there's a real sort of feeling across many different sections of the Iranian political establishment, the foreign policy establishment, that there isn't much point in a deeper or more meaningful engagement or discussion with the United States at this point. I think what we can see, what I expect to see in this new presidency, is a real move away from attempts towards meaningful improvements in relations with the United States and even the West in general. I think that what we will see, what I would expect to see, is a much greater priority on relations with China and other states to the east of Iran. I think there has been a general feeling of exhaustion over the past 20 plus years at the highest levels of the Iranian foreign policy making establishment, with the idea of extended negotiations with the United States. There's a feeling that they don't really ultimately deliver anything dramatically different in terms of relations. But of course, they cannot be ignored completely because of the outsized influence that the United States exercises over the global economy and thus over Iran's economy in the form of sanctions. On the American side, I think similarly, this relatively new administration has its hands full on the foreign policy front. There are many much more pressing concerns, perhaps, than Iran. However, I think that the Biden administration feels very strongly that they would like to reinvigorate and re-enter some sort of JCPOA with Iran if possible. I think that on the whole, though, this is an administration that also is looking to exit as much as it can from the region and leave regional players to sort of sort out their own affairs. This is also an administration that is looking towards China in its own way and for a different set of reasons. So I think, and I think when you combine that with the fact that the Democratic Party in the US generally, their foreign policy brain trust, if you will, has always leaned towards a sort of approach of containment and multilateralism towards Iran, rather than sort of maximum pressure that we saw under the Trump administration. This is the Democrats have traditionally been of the mind that if you work with allies and partners, you can, contain Iran's regional influence in ways that the U.S. can sort of live with. And I think that, therefore you have two countries that neither of which I think are really placing a key strategic
Sorry to interrupt you, sir.
emphasis on.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. We're going to go back to Mr. Hassan Ahmadian, who is specialized in political studies. So when it comes to the sanctions, this is a pivotal matter when it comes to the discourse that he talked about, and that the hardliners have concentrated on. They concentrated on national development. So this was the point that was underlined for them to be able to reach economic solutions. And this emanates from the reality of the nuclear deal. After the signing of the nuclear deal with the different international players, the Iranians realized that this is not going to lead to solutions. And the United States and its possibility to impact the world economy, as John had said, from the United States of America, this influence is there and it influences the other powers. So that is why relying on these players in order to solve economic problems, this kind of thesis is no longer the thesis that is being underlined by the hardliners or the conservatives. So we had Himmeti, the candidate who competed with the president-elect during this presidency. He was underlining this idea. So the president is persuaded that the solution to problems lies internally, lies inside Iran. That is why he wants to restructure the economy. He wants to reduce the level of unemployment and also inflation. This, in his view, is something that can be achieved internally and not through cooperation with other countries. So this is a discourse that is different from his predecessors. So what is this going to lead to? So this depends on what the current government is going to do. In an opinion poll that was carried out 2 months ago in at Maryland University, where Iranians in general see that economic problems emanate from mismanagement and corruption. The current president-elect, concentrates on the same point, which is corruption. So many economists inside Iran who give advice to the president-elect, they concentrate on this particular point. They talk about mismanagement, they talk about corruption. These are two very important components when it comes to economic problems, and then relations with other countries and sanctions. That is why the solution is to lift the sanctions through combating corruption and restructuring the economy internally, and also relying on internal capabilities. Dr. Hassan, please allow me to move once again to Dr. Fatima Al-Smadi. Dr. Fatima Al-Smadi, what are the challenges that are imposed by Iran's influence regionally? We always remember in the phone call that took place between Raisi and the Emir of the State of Qatar, Raisi talked about group security or regional security as a means of stability and economic development. So this constitutes a challenge when it comes to the relationship of Iran with neighboring countries, particularly joint or group security. Collective security is not the only model, although we would need such a model, which is collective security. Let's go back to the conditions that have been set by Raisi in order to achieve collective security. He linked this component to ending foreign intervention in the GCC, to have no intervention whatsoever. And this position is not only particular to Raisi. All previous Iranian presidents have called for zero foreign intervention in the GCC. But this happens at a time where Iran started talking explicitly about putting an end to the American presence in the region. And if we look at the map, the bases, American bases, this region is ranked second in terms of the number of bases that exist in the region after the United States of America. Almost every week, a base is targeted either in Iraq or Syria. That is why having collective security can happen by asking the foreign powers, asking the U.S. to leave the region, particularly that the relationships, that this region has particular relationships with the United States of America. This is another challenge. There is another challenge, which is Iranian regional influence. This is something that is relevant to the internal affairs of Iran. I do not want to talk at great length about this because this is the field of specialization of Dr. Ahmedian. So perhaps the regional influence of Iran is one of the topics that are concentrated on. If Ibrahim Raisi wants to achieve this objective, he would need to unify the ranks of voices inside Iran. The foreign ministry cannot have one discourse and Faylaq al-Quds a different discourse, or I would like to move now to Professor Gartner. Professor Gartner, Europeans, did they want to reach an agreement with Rouhani, or did they want to wait until Raisi becomes president? Your comments, sir.
European Union does not really make a difference between these presidents. So they don't see that President Raisi will move away from the negotiations. On the contrary, they see that the Supreme Leader and Raisi stressed that the negotiations should continue. And also I have to say that in Vienna here, a lot has been achieved already in the three baskets. And the one basket where they negotiated, or that they are negotiating maybe, the sanctions relief, about 1,500 sanctions have agreed upon to be lifted. So there are some remaining sanctions which are imposed on individuals, but this 1,500 sanctions would have an impact on the Iranian economy, and they are all nuclear related. So if the sanctions are lifted, this would have a tremendous impact on the improvement of the Iranian economy. So it would be in the interest of Iran that the GCPA would be implemented. And after all, President Raisi can take the credit of it. He will be the beneficiary of this economic improvement. If the GCPOA negotiations fail for different reasons, it would have a negative impact on the Iranian economy. I'm glad that Dr. Ahmadian stressed that President Raisi wants to focus on the economy. So that would be a great contribution, the implementation of the GCPA for the Iranian economy.
I would like to move now to Mr. Qazvinian. So what are the points of difference other than the nuclear deal with Iran? And can they reach a settlement vis-a-vis these matters during Raisi presidency, or is escalation going to be the feature of the coming phase?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. That is exactly where my concerns are at the moment. I think that the U.S., as I think I've really always predicted, the U.S.-Iran antagonism has moved well beyond the conversations about the nuclear deal. I think it was always a little bit unrealistic to assume that somehow these disagreements can be contained to just nuclear issues. I think what I'm particularly concerned with right now is that for 2 years now, the United States and Iran have been engaged in, this kind of ongoing exchange of kind of small-scale tit-for-tat military skirmishes, fought mostly in places like Iraq and Syria. And I think it's easy to ignore that, or to think that, that can sort of be contained or to continue without taking a turn for the worse. But I think as a historian, what this moment that we're in reminds me of is actually 1987 and the so-called tanker war that was being fought in the Persian Gulf in the midst of the Iran-Iraq war. That's something that not a lot of people think about maybe very much anymore, but I think the similarities are pretty striking to the present day. In that, you sort of 2 years of small-scale skirmishes in the Persian Gulf, sea mines. You even have in both cases a civilian airliner that was shot down. All of these things have happened over the last 2 years. But I think there's a key difference between the tanker war of 1987 and the exchanges that have been taking place between the United States and Iran since 2019, which is that in 1987, there were two main differences. One is that the U.S. had a very clear end game. Their goal was to bring about to ensure that Iran was not victorious in its war against Saddam Hussein. And the other big difference was that in 1987, Iran was very, very weak. It had been fighting a 7-year-long war with Iraq, and it wasn't very difficult for the U.S. To bring Iran's defeat in the war. This time, neither of those things is present. I'm not sure that Iran is, although economically it's weak, politically and militarily, it's not as decimated as it was in 1987. And secondly, and I think more importantly, there isn't a very clear American end game here with these kind of tit-for-tat exchanges. Really, this administration has inherited the policy of Donald Trump, a process that the Trump administration set into motion about 2 years ago with this kind of maximum pressure strategy. And it's now taking on a logic of its own. Even though both Iran and the U.S. have, I think, been very careful to avoid unnecessary escalation, it's not always easy to guarantee that things won't escalate. And I think that especially when there isn't a clear end game in sight, I think that there's a risk that these... Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. We would like to go back to Mr. Hassan Ahmadian. What are the impacts that are going to be left by the current president? So there is a consensus internally is very important in order to set a framework for the policy of the president. It is clear that there are a number of priorities, as Dr. Fatma has said. So there are regional priorities. So the region is a priority when it comes to the foreign policy of Raisi. So the president-elect did not concentrate on the international level. He concentrated on the region. So there are a number of institutions, there are a number of decision makers that are in the political scene. So the ability of the president-elect to have one voice that would prevail over other voices, this is something that happens at the level of the National Security Council. So the makeup entails that the president should have a very important role when it comes to managing the different dossiers and votes over those dossiers, and also to unify the ranks of the decision makers inside Iran. All of these impact his ability to direct his foreign policy. In my view, the president-elect is liked in this regard. The Speaker of Parliament is from the same political current, and it is clear that he is supported by so many in the National Security Council. He has not faced so many impediments when it comes to the foreign policy he set, as it was the case for his predecessor, which required so many discussions, so many pressures in order to manage or direct the foreign policy. But the president-elect, in my view, is much more liked at the level of the National Security Council in managing the foreign policy, and consequently I think that concentrating on the region is going to be the same point of interest of the regime in general. The finding solutions to the nuclear deal is going to be important for the group, but it is not going to be as a priority as it was during the Rouhani presidency. It is not going to be the only priority in the foreign policy of Iran. There are some other priorities. Perhaps if we can, we lift the sanctions as the president-elect has said, but he wants to neutralize the sanctions. So the framework that was used in the foreign policy by Rouhani is not going to be the same when it comes to Ibrahim Raisi's policy. So he's going to concentrate on the region in particular. So these are the points that are going to be underlined in his agenda. The presenter is interjecting. I would like to go back to Dr. Fatima Asmadi. The relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia has gone through so many differences and tensions. In your view, do you think this relationship is going to be different during the Raisi's presidency? Yes, there are a number of indicators that say that perhaps they're going to move for the best or for what is better. So amongst these indicators is the talks that have been hosted by Iraq, and some news say that Oman is going to have future talks as well. So this indicates that dialogue is going to lead to better relationships or to advancements in the relationship between the two countries. If we look at the kind of talks between the different countries, the intelligence representatives of the different countries, this shows that this is a much more representative kind of talks compared to previous talks. Iran faces economic difficulties, and Raisi wants to concentrate on the region. Perhaps for him this is going to be an outlet from the economic situation in Iran. There is a direct security challenge when it comes to the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and this challenge is particular to the situation in Yemen, because Saudi Arabia wants to limit the influence of Iran in in Yemen because the Houthis represent a direct threat to Saudi Arabia. That is why they want this relationship to be controlled, the influence to be controlled. So that is why they want to reach a political solution in Yemen. If Iran and Saudi Arabia manage to arrive to even partial solutions to the pending issues, this would indicate that it would be possible for the talks to be successful. There is another matter. It is necessary to reach a conviction whereby the regional powers would be able to find solutions to the problems. The different Arab parties in the GCC should not be present in international talks with Iran. For Iran, these talks should start regionally and directly. And in my view, this mechanism or problem-solving mechanism would be much better than allowing the or to wait for the European side or the American side to wait for these countries to participate. Professor Gartner, so what are the dossiers of difference that are going to be posed in the short and medium terms in your view? Go ahead, sir.
Let me first say, I do think there is a link between regional stability and the GCPOA. As Dr. John Gaslignan, if I'm spelling correct your name, stressed, there have been skirmishes and incidents after 2018. It was pretty quiet between 2015 when the GCPOA has been adopted in 2018. So President Trump's maximum pressure, of course, led to instability. Whoever was behind this incidents. And also, there's another link. If there's no agreement, maybe Iran will continue with its nuclear program. And the IAEA access to verification might be limited. And even maybe the inspectors might have to leave the country. So immediately Israel would cry foul and say, we see Iran is now creating the bomb. Military strikes will follow. Israel will try to involve the US. And that would be a tremendous, dangerous situation for the region. But what the predecessors have said, regional issues have to be addressed regionally, of course. So when it comes to missiles or regional behavior, this is not an issue of the GCPOA. So they have to be addressed in regional arms control negotiations, confidence building measures, better relations between Arab states and Iran, especially also when it comes to the Palestinian issue. So a GCPOA will be the prerequisite for regional stability, but there can be a follow-up on talks about other issues which are not part of the GCPOA. The GCPOA addresses the nuclear issues.
We would like to move now to Mr. Ghazwinian, Dr. Zon. How is the United States of America going to deal with the regional influence of Iran, taking into account the declared objective of Iran, which is to make the different foreign forces exit the region, particularly Iraq?
Yeah, I think this is obviously it's going to be a challenge. I think that in some ways, strangely, that is a priority that seems to somewhat align with the current administration in Washington, which actually is interested in reducing its military footprint in the region. Obviously, the United States is currently removing troops from Afghanistan. I think obviously. Iran has felt for quite some time that a lot of these regional issues are best discussed with the regional partners. But the very significant U.S. military presence in the region for a long time has made that difficult. It's added a different kind of dimension to everything. We have seen some encouraging developments and conversations taking place between Iran and Saudi Arabia in recent months. I think this is something that is quietly being encouraged by the Biden administration. It's clear that this is an administration which is not going to be offering unqualified support to Saudi Arabia in the way that his predecessor did. But as I said earlier, I think at the end of the day, for the U.S., the Middle East is simply not the priority that it was 20 years ago. And for Iran, relations with the United States are simply not the priority they were 20 years ago. It's a very operational set of priorities at this point. Iran wants sanctions removed. It's willing to have larger conversations about regional proxies and so on, and missiles and everything. But those are conversations that Iran has always been willing to have. Actually, for a long time, there was resistance among the American foreign policy establishment to having larger conversations with Iran. Now that seems to be something that people are more interested in doing. The problem with that, of course, is that's a very large conversation, and Iran views regional issues very, very differently from the United States. It views the issue of missiles, for example, as a critical. When the U.S. talks about ballistic missiles, Iran wants to talk about the very large amount of military aid that's been given to Saudi Arabia and to Israel and to other regional allies, and will insist on its right to maintain its own missile capability in the face of those kinds of arrangements. So, look, I think these are conversations that can be had, but they'll probably go on for a while. I think in many ways this is picking up where Barack Obama wanted to start in 2009. With a fundamentally different approach to U.S.-Iran relations. He didn't get very far with that. Remains to be seen how far the Biden administration will get.
So I'd like to move now to Dr. Hassan Ahmadian. Are we going to expect a conservative, a fundamentalist, a hardline kind of team? Or a different kind of team? So the president-elect said that he's not going to the president-elect talk about pluralism and talks about competence as the only deciding factor for the officials that are going to be appointed. So these are the persons that surround the president, and we expect that the majority of persons are going to be held, the majority of posts are going to be held by those revolutionaries. So there are some officials that are going to be kept, and perhaps he's going to seek to appoint persons from the reformist parties. But perhaps it is something that we have to wait to see. We will see how he's going to be committed to this kind of pluralism in his view. What is clear is that there are some doubts by the reformists as to the pathway that is going to be chosen by Raisi. Dr. Fatima Asmadi. So how is the normalization of relations is going to impact
We spoke about the security challenges, but the issue of normalization in Israel's usage of the Gulf region is a challenge that trumps the Americans' presence in the region, because Iran views Israel as a challenge to the region, and thus this issue with its latest developments is not something that Iran can look the other way regarding it. And we can see the escalation of tank wars between Iran and Israel of late, and the Gulf country has seen a number of attacks that come within this framework. There are those who bet on the economic factor, which is that the UAE is the second economic partner of Iran, as well as the first economic partner for Iran in the Gulf. But this problem has been discussed in Iran, and the answer is that Khamenei said the economic interests should not prevail over the other interests. So the economic factor here is important, and the other issue is that there is a threat of betting on Israel as a tool to contain Iran. And I do not say that this is realistic. Looking at Israel from this angle by the Gulf countries, in my view, is like someone who shoots himself in the foot. If we look at the developments of shadow wars between Iran and Israel, if the presence of Israel remains in the Gulf region, then the Gulf region will be an area, a battleground between both sides. So this is another priority here in terms of the talks between Iran and the Gulf countries that should be resolved. Dr. Heinz Gartner, how will Europe deal with the Iranian missile program, especially that the president of Iran said that Iran will not negotiate over this issue?
This missile program will not be part of the GCPOA talks. So the missile program will be addressed in a different forum, probably in a regional forum. However, there is no arms control agreement in history which includes only the missiles of one party. So a regional arms control has to address, of course, the conventional weapons of other states in the region as well. So maybe in the agreement there will be a clause saying there have to be follow-up talks about missiles and other regional issues. If one includes now these other issues into the GCPOA, it is not it is a non-starter. The same is true for regional behavior. There is no arms control in his agreement in history which includes behavior. So there wouldn't be any arms control agreement during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US if Russia's Soviet Union's behavior would have been included. On the contrary, it was a success that during the tensions of the Cold War there have been arms control agreements. So it would be a success now to have regional arms control agreements involving states of the region. So there is a model what we can look at. That's the Helsinki final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe after 1975. So which addressed the regional security issues and talked not about enemies, not about foes, but about common security and cooperative security.
Okay, so many frameworks that determine the relationship between the West and Iran in the future. Here we go to Mr. John Qazwizian. What is the impact of the Israeli factor here in terms of the crisis between Iran and the West?
Israel played a very significant factor in slowing down and in many ways even foiling Barack Obama's very strongly touted initiative towards trying to improve relations with Iran. I outlined this in great detail in my book, The History of This. Obviously Israel has a new government now, and so does the United States. I think that the new government under Naftali Bennett in Israel is going to really want to demonstrate that to the Israeli public that it is able to maintain a better relationship with the United States than Netanyahu was able to. I think that's always been one of the criticisms on Netanyahu is that he took a very aggressive approach with relations with the U.S. So I think Israel is going to be trying to demonstrate that it's not in the business of derailing American policy. However, Israel is also going to want to play a role in trying to shape that policy, as it did before, as I say, during the Obama administration. The difference is that Joe Biden has generally speaking, a much warmer relationship with Israel than his predecessor did, and the other difference, of course, is that Joe Biden is not embarked on quite as ambitious an attempt to kind of reset relations with Iran as Barack Obama was in 2009. And he's also, I think, probably learned from some of those lessons. I think, we saw Israel attempting a few weeks ago to kind of try to derail negotiations by sabotaging nuclear plants, for example, Natanz. But that very quickly came to a stop, and one imagines under pretty heavy pressure from the
Okay,
United States.
okay. And now we come to the social media to follow the followers of our page on Facebook and Twitter. Then we will take the comments of the participants. We have asked, will the new Iranian president bring about a change in his world's policy towards the neighboring Arab countries, or relations will witness more problems? And where are the Iranian relations headed with Europe and the US? Among those comments, Abu Abdullah on Twitter, who has said, relations are going to the worst, of course, because of the Iranian animosity towards the world and the Arab countries in the Gulf. And Ibrahim al-Yamani says, the West raises a fuss on the news channels, and Abdul Rahim is saying the best thing that Iran did is to change the faces and the personalities, and they are all respected faces because of the regime of the supreme leader. And Raisi has come from the judiciary, so there might be a change in the country. Saeed Shawardi says, in case both sides have a will that will not be pressured by a third party, and they are willing to deal with the mistakes, and we know that concession is not a loss but an investment in order to prove goodwill, then there might be rapprochement between Iran and the Arab world, and we really need that so desperately. And he says Iran's policy to the neighbors will not change, and it is because those who manage policies is the supreme leader in Iran and not the president. And we want each guest to comment. We begin with Mr. Hassan Ahmadian. Dr. Hassan Ahmadian, please, what's your comments on what you have heard now? The reality lies between both. There will be a change with every government that comes to Iran with different priorities, focusing internally and externally. So for this change, it is possible to have influence on Iran's policy internally and externally. So it is a chance. The president-elect focuses on the region. It is a chance for the region to get into negotiations that they have abandoned for many years, 10 years specifically, and to get into negotiations that will provide security and stability instead of focusing on divisions vis-a-vis normalization with Israel or the American ability to destabilize the region for this party or that party. So regional approaches have proven that they are better for the region. At the end of the day, there doesn't seem to be much to lose for those regional countries. And now we go to Dr. Fatima Smadi, and with a comment also on the question raised. Will the new president bring about a change to the policy of Iran towards the Arab region and in general? She says, my answer is related to the comments we heard. They reflect that the ground needed for this dialogue is still missing. There is a dire need to build trust, and this is the main framework in order to reach this goal. From my point of view, this is related to the cognitive map, if you will, for the neighbors of Iran, which is something that's not easy. It is problematic, but the issue here is that there should be building of the framework which is needed for the region, because this is related to changing the rhetoric that is going on now. So this is important and it can be achieved. Same question to Dr. Heinz Gartner. Will the new president in Iran bring about a change in his policy towards the Arab regional countries and in general with the rest of the world?
First of all, I think it's important that the president focuses on regional issues. However, one of the most important issues here in the regional situation is the Palestinian issue. So we had the Kushner plan by President Trump and also the Abraham Accords. Both ignored the interests and aspiration of the Palestinians. After all, this Abraham Accords, the so-called normalization between Israel and Arab states, was considered to be an anti-Iranian alliance. The European Union always supported this two-state solution for the Palestinians and Israel. And these two concepts, these two plans, the Kushner plan and the Abraham Accords, would make a two-state solution impossible. So if there is an rapprochement between the Arab states and Iran, they have to address the Palestinian issues, and also they have to remind the Arab states of their own peace plan of 2002, that they would recognize and have diplomatic relations with Israel only on the basis of the 67 borders, which is the basis for a two-state solution. But this could also be a basis for the Iranian-Arab dialogue on the region. However, I know that Iran does not really support the two-state solution, but if the European Union and the Biden administration have to be involved, both of them support the two-state solution. It has to be negotiated, but the Arab-Iranian rapprochement would be a precondition also to solve the Palestinian issue.
Okay, in 1.5 minutes, Mr. John Qazwinian, the same question. Will the new Iranian president, Raisi, bring about a change in his policy with the Arab region and foreign policy in general? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, as I said before, I think that there's one of the things that's not often appreciated about Iranian foreign policy is the extent to which the president has a lot of sway over the tone and the approach and the priorities. But a lot of the key red lines are going to be the same. I do think that there is, there's a lot that we just simply don't know about Ibrahim Raisi's approach to foreign affairs. I think Dr. Ahmadian is correct when he says that this is a presidency that's likely to be very focused on domestic issues, perhaps more than any other, and kind of the real principles of the Iranian Revolution and what they mean moving forward. I also think that Asma Al-Qadi also made a very important point about trust. A lot of these issues can be resolved very easily in an atmosphere of trust and constructive dialogue. I've always felt that Iran and the United States, it would not be very difficult for them to set their differences aside. That it's simply impossible to be negotiating over something as complicated as a nuclear issue in an absence of trust. and goodwill, which is exactly why I think we saw the nuclear deal collapse in 2018. Conversely, though, when that trust and goodwill is there, I believe these issues can be resolved very, very easily. So I think that is the real determining factor. And I have often felt that, like sort of conservative, or if you prefer, more hardline leaders sometimes have an easier time negotiating with their enemies than so-called reformists and liberals. So I think there's no reason to be overly pessimistic. This could very well be an administration that sees a reset in Iran's relations with outside powers.
Okay, and with this we come to the conclusion and end of this seminar organized by Al Jazeera Centre for Studies in coordination with Al Jazeera Mubasher channel, and it is regarding the new president. We thank our guests by Skype, Hassan Ahmadian, Dr. Hassan Ahmadian, with full title being read out, and from Doha, Dr. Fatima Asmadi, with full title being read out, and from Vienna, Dr. Heinz Gartner, with full title being read out, and also we thank similarly John Qazwinian from Philadelphia with your full title being read out. Thank you all. We have to leave it here, gentlemen. Thank you so much for taking part. Thank you all indeed.